wooded area, but search and rescue were having a hard time reaching the plane. My heart sank because I now knew the terrain was not good. Yet I remained determined not to think the worst. I began praying that God would help them to get to the plane so that if medical assistance was needed, help would be there for them. During this time, a couple had come over to take me to Rick and Linda's home so that we could all be together as we waited for updates. But I felt this was where they left from that morning, and this was where they were to return that night. Therefore, I could not leave our home. Time slowly dragged on as I waited without any updates on the situation. Anxious for more information, at 5:30 for the third time, I again called their house and Rick answered. After asking him had he not heard anything, he responded, "There are no survivors." Unable to speak, I burst into tears and handed the phone to my nephew, Jamie. Family members and friends had arrived, and because of my response, no one needed to ask me anything, for they all knew. The most violent storm had hit my life, and it had hit with a fury. It was not only the death of my husband and 22-year-old twin daughters, but it was also the death of dreams I had for our future. Dreams of Jonathan and me growing old together. Dreams of seeing Jennifer and Kimberly married and having a family. My dreams had been shattered. Later that night, I was at Rick and Linda's home in their study, away from everyone except Linda and a friend of hers, when Felix Sabatas enters the room to give us an update. After the update, Linda's friend asked Felix who was on the plane. It had not once entered my mind to ask that question. I knew there would have been at least 2 pilots because this is a requirement of Hendrick Motorsports. As Felix began naming the people, I thought the list would never end. I sat in shock and my mouth dropped open because I knew all those precious people with the exception of Scott Latham. I could not believe what I was hearing. I had thought Rick and Linda were grieving for my losses when I met them in their front yard as we cried and embraced. I had no idea their son, Ricky, was on the plane. It would be a month before I would share this with Linda because at the moment I was speechless and still trying to process the information. I began thinking about the family members of those who were killed and would also be suffering from their loss. I was also told the remains of those in the plane could not be brought down from the mountain until around 1 p.m. the next day. It felt as if a truckload of bricks had been dumped on my already grieving heart. I could not sleep. All night long, I kept thinking, they're not going to leave them by themselves. They're not going to leave them by themselves. In the early hours of the morning, I would doze for a few minutes from exhaustion, only to awaken without one single thought. It had brought me even more grief. You may be wondering, did I not know 2 Corinthians 5:8, which says, to be absent from the body is to be present or at home with the Lord. Yes, I knew this, and I would say this verse many, many times to myself during the night, but my numb and grieving heart at that time could find no comfort in those words. I found myself feeling helpless as a mom who had been there for the twins when they scraped their elbows and knees, broken an arm, were sick, or just needed me. Or as Jonathan's wife, when he likewise had been sick in the hospital or had surgery, I had also been there for him. But for the first time, I was not, nor could not, be there. I was also remembering when Jennifer and Kimberly had flown to Atlanta to be fitted for bridesmaids' dresses for their sister's wedding. Jennifer told me as they approached Charlotte, they had hit a lot of turbulence and it had scared her. She had gripped the handles of the seat and began praying. Therefore, I kept wondering if they had been afraid and I was not there for them. I desperately wanted to hang on my role as a wife and a mother, but it was only when I let go and released them into God's hands that God's words brought me comfort and peace. I had to surrender to His will. On November the 6th, when we went to the crash site on Bull Mountain, it was a beautiful day. As I stood right above where the plane had made impact, I looked directly in front of me and could see the airport where they were to have landed and far beyond. But my eyes kept being drawn to a small area on the ground below me on the right. The only visible thing to me was the ashes from the crash. So I decided to go in a circular path down the steep terrain to where my eyes were fixed. When I got there, I took my hand and lightly brushed with my fingertips the ashes. And when I did, I heard a noise. So I took my thumb and index finger and pressed them slightly below the layers of ashes. When I did, I felt something. So I pinched my fingers together to lift into view whatever it was, and I found myself holding car keys. Linda quickly came over to me to ask if they were Ricky's, in which I replied, "No, they're Jennifer's." I had recognized our house key. I stood there thinking of the hundreds of people who had been on Bull Mountain, from the FAA to search and rescue, the Virginia State Highway Patrol, the fire department, medical personnel, volunteers, and more, and God had allowed me to be the one to find Jennifer's keys. I thanked God because their personal possessions were now even more important to me. While on the mountain, I also was told 8 people had camped out on the mountaintop from the night of the plane crash until the following Wednesday when the plane was airlifted out by helicopter. I could not thank God enough for taking care of the burden I had chosen to carry. Scripture says that God knows the desires of our hearts, and He had already answered my desire. They had not been left alone on that mountain. I would also later learn about God's sovereignty over the fog in locating the plane. Kristen Tinsley had asked Jeff Flournoy, who is the director of helicopters at the racetrack, to go up in a helicopter to see if he could locate the plane. What Jeff and his crew witnessed could only have been from God. With tears in his eyes, Jeff said the mountain was completely covered in fog and the signal strength from the transponder was coming from somewhere higher up and out of reach. And then it happened. The fog above them began to clear as if a pathway was being made to lead them up the mountain. Higher and higher they flew until they were directly over the plane. God had led them straight to the crash site. From there, they were able to report the exact location of the plane and their assessment of the situation on the ground to search and rescue. And Jeff said, just as quickly as the pathway had opened, it started to close, and they were forced to head back. The weather on Bull Mountain would not clear again for 2 days. It was something Jeff said he would never forget because he knew he had witnessed a miracle from God. You may be thinking, why God would not clear a pathway for the pilots to see the mountaintop, but instead